think I obviously speak for everyone if I thank you for your very inspirational talk and very insightful. I'm sure there are a lot of questions or comments, so let's open up the floor for that. We have about 15-20 minutes. Yes.
Sorry. Many work groups here are looking at the structure within this university and trying to transform that. Also, not only for this university, of course, but for the whole society. Should we work with the same puzzle pieces we have right now, or should we totally overthrow this structure and build something completely new? Difficult question, maybe. Sorry.
Creative destruction.
Why would you throw away what you've already done? And where would you replace it with? Is it because I mentioned a number of other strategic goals than the ones that are embedded within these working groups? Is that it? Because I've understood that there is a working group which wants to delve deeper into financialisation, not only at the University of Amsterdam, but more broadly, which is what you should do, I think. And part of the working groups will be dealing with democracy and how to set up a more radical democratic mode of governing this particular university. So I would stick to what you've already done. It doesn't go that far.
Yeah, I want to make a comment on your comment about the media, the fact that they're not doing their job. I think the media is doing its job and is doing an excellent job. The job of media, firstly, is not to tell truth, it's not to tell information, it's to make profit. Media corporations are often parts of corporations which are part of larger conglomerates. And the second job then is to do deep indoctrination of the population, so to speak. Which is why, in my opinion, if you really want to read the press and know what's actually going on, read the financial press like the London Financial Times. Why? Because business people must know what's actually going on. You know, they need to look beyond filters. They need to see what the actual situation on the ground is so that they can make rational business decisions. But for the rest of the population, it's very important, especially for people from your and my background, privileged people who will go on to positions of power. You mentioned something about co-optation. It's especially important, and this is where the liberal newspapers, the liberal spectrum comes in, where they set the boundaries of what we are supposed to think and decide. So let's not be, I mean you any offense. I think it's a mistake to look at media, at least mainstream media here I'm talking about. I think there's a huge scope of alternative media that exists out there. It should be supported and nurtured, but let's be careful about thinking who our enemies are and who our friends are, because if you believe mainstream media, you will start loving the people that you should hate and hating the people that you should love. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more, and you're younger than I am, but you're even more cynical, if I may say that, with regard to mainstream media than I am. I sort of still had some sort of a hope that mainstream media would do what academics should be doing, namely speaking truth to power. And it's very obvious that they don't do that. It's part of one big entertainment show. And I have to say, also with regard to your suggestion, that you should read the financial press. I kicked out all my Dutch newspapers, and I only have left a subscription to the Financial Times, which indeed talks truth, even to power, sometimes.
Yeah, you speak of the elite in terms of them being consciously evil, maybe. Like my question is, we know there's an elite up there, but I wonder, what are their thoughts behind their actions? Do they think they're doing the right thing? Are they convinced of doing the right thing in their actions? Or are they consciously keeping us down? What are their motivations to do what they do? And do they still think they're being human in doing this?
I think that there's part of the elite who willingly is basically trying to screw you, and that part of the elite is to be found within the financial services sector. The other part of the elite are political and more administrative elites. They sincerely believe in the neoliberal bullshit that they're selling. And it's related to a disconnect. As I indicated, they don't lead normal lives. They don't meet us. They don't know what life on the ground looks like. They live in a bubble. And this bubble allows them to reproduce the neoliberal bullshit which they actually believe in, up until there is a reality check. And again, this is going to be a compliment. This is one of those reality checks. And you saw it in the eyes of Gunning and the others, that they didn't know what they were confronted with. And that sort of indicates, the shell shock in their eyes indicates that they have been living in a bubble. And that bubble needs to be burst. And we're basically in the process of bursting that bubble. So no, these people are not evil. They're stupid.
Over the last years, I've been noticing that many people seem to think that the purpose of a business is to make profit, and I'm very surprised by this because it doesn't seem logical at all. I think the purpose of a business should be to make good work or stuff or services or whatever. And I was wondering, is there a movement of academics or teachers that tells business students that the purpose of a business is not to make profit?
It's a very good question, and you're right. It's not obvious that the purpose of a corporation should be to make profit. Actually, there is this sort of comparative literature which indicates that different businesses, different corporations in different jurisdictions actually also have different strategic goals. German firms used to have as a strategic goal something like technical excellence. Japanese firms were all about market share, but it was the American corporations which basically were about short-term profit making. And the amazing thing is that through to an increasing dispersal of a discourse which originally came out of the United States, which of course was minted by the big sort of neoliberal fuckers of them all, namely economists, was minted by economists, gradually trickled down into other sort of business schools, also in other jurisdictions, which at the end of the day has resulted in transforming all corporations, even Volkswagen AG, into a for-profit, short-term profit-oriented organization who tries to minimize costs by doing all sorts of labor arbitrage, basically letting the cars being manufactured in places like Spain, Poland, where labor costs much less than in Germany, and doing all sorts of tax arbitrage by setting up all sorts of shell companies in, of course, the biggest tax haven of the world, which is Amsterdam. So, no, there is an alternative, but these alternatives have increasingly become marginalized. One caveat to that is that we're talking, of course, about large publicly quoted corporations. 99% of the firms are not large and are not publicly quoted, and they operate according to completely different logics, except when they're suppliers to these big multinational corporations, and then they're sort of subject to the same kind of efficiency drives as we students and staff here in the university are subject to. And then are there scholars who try to teach? Yeah, there's some of them, but it's marginal, I'm afraid. Yeah, sure.
Hi, my question is, when we will have democratized this university, because we will still have a huge amount of debt. My question is how would you suggest we finance that huge amount of debt? Because then we would still be beholden to the financial sector. We'd have just taken out the middleman, which is the CVB, which did not stand up for our rights, but we're still, as a university, as an organization, whether we're democratic or not, have a lawful obligation to repay our debt, even though I'd probably say that's default on it, but still. What would you advise us?
This is a very difficult and a good question. I immediately have to say that I don't have an answer. But the question as such perfectly illustrates the dependency that is being created by going into bed with the financial services sector. We have all seen, I can imagine that you, with the same kind of enthusiasm, what happened in Greece, where Syriza, who basically stated that they wanted to renegotiate the overall debt burden of Greece, and they wanted to enter with that particular claim in negotiations with their Eurozone partners, won the elections, and I can imagine that also you, just like me, have become quite depressed about the fact that even though you have a democratic mandate to change the conditions of those agreements, that you basically end up empty-handed because you're beholden to the fact that you have to pay off those debts. So that sort of suggests that we also need, and I don't know to what extent you're willing to do that, we need to engage in some sort of historical research. Who are the bastards who are responsible for this huge debt burden of the University of Amsterdam? It's not the current CVB. These are the predecessors of this particular CVB board of directors. And I've got the impression that it's this one guy who is famous for wearing these collared shoes. Does anyone know whom I'm talking about? Noorda, absolutely. The former director of the Verenigde Samenwerkende Nederlandse Universiteiten, who basically initiated this whole process of real estate development and was at the cradle of this huge indebtedness of the University of Amsterdam. And this guy, I don't know how to put it in a sort of decent way, is so very much the embodiment of what is wrong with the Dutch political and administrative elite. This sort of vain guy walking around with red and blue shoes, moving from one reception to the other, moving up in the rankings to other kinds of aggregate organizations. We need some sort of a waarheidscommittee. We need a committee of, what was a truth and reconciliation committee. And we need to set that up as students and staff collectively. And we need to interview, again, under oath, the people who are responsible for this mess. Because basically, the current board of directors is simply burdened with this huge historical debt load, and of course the real estate plans which belong to that. That's my answer. I don't have an answer. You can default, but even the Greeks didn't dare to do that. For good reasons, perhaps.
Let me say, I'm very happy you just stated that the cause of the students here today and this week is larger than just the university. It's also about the public sphere. And I myself, I'm a medical doctor working here in Amsterdam, and I was urged to come here to listen to you tonight. Okay. Because patients and doctors and healthcare workers, we suffer very, very, very much from privatization of public sphere. That bad during the last 8 years when healthcare has been privatized in the Netherlands, that even now the relationship between doctors and patients is being commercialized. It's not normal anymore that you can just keep on working with your patients. No, the contract 1 year can come to you, next year to you. So it has become a product now. And what I suffer very much from is this paranoid position from insurance companies towards healthcare workers. And I just don't know, and I've been thinking about it quite some nights now, in the last year, how we can just move away from this paranoid position towards healthcare workers from the financial industry. So maybe you can help me out a little bit.
I've got two suggestions, and indeed, this is a much wider disease. And it's related to something else that might be a nice sort of topic for a committee. We seem to have lost the ability to formulate what public goods are. Public goods have increasingly become privatized, as you indicated, and we have lost any sort of language which allows us to counter the dominant neoliberal economistic kind of narrative, which comes out from all sorts of advisory think tanks, advisory institutes, think tanks, insurers, etc., etc. And I have a sort of this is a hope which I hardly dare to pronounce. Why don't we transform the University of Amsterdam in the birth cradle of the Dutch version of Podemos? Why don't we do that? Why don't we transform this into a sort of a wider political movement which tries to take citizens' concerns seriously? Okay, let's bracket this. I've said it. I wanted to say this, so I've said it. The one thing that I can advise you to do is basically the same as the students of this university have done. Apparently, They don't care what kind of protests or irritations or resistance you formulate or act upon. The only thing that they care about is their real estate. So occupy! Go to the head office! Collect a few of your colleagues, let's say 40 of your colleagues, and simply occupy the head office of one of the big health insurers in the Netherlands. And see how they're going. Let's be clear about it. And let's be clear about this. There is momentum. If you do it right now, on the back of all that has been happening here in Amsterdam with relation to the University of Amsterdam, you actually may start something which can then indeed become something that is a broader movement. So again, advice to everyone here who is a representative of other semi-public sectors in the Netherlands: occupy an iconic building. It doesn't matter what kind of iconic building, occupy an iconic building and see what happens.
Hi. Now that we have gathered here and created a space in which all kinds of students from the University of Amsterdam come together, I've been speaking a lot with students from economy, and they say that they only get neoliberal theory, and that it is presented as if it is the only truth.
Sure.
I come from Mexico, and at the University of Mexico they teach, in economics, they teach all the theories. And
Not only mainstream economics.
not only mainstream economics. So I think we are dealing with indoctrination here. And yeah.
I fully agree with that. Of course, neoliberal narratives need priests. And of course, politicians and other members of the elites are like the priests of the neoliberal church. But the texts that the texts that they use in order to do their priest-like incantations of neoliberal wisdoms come from somewhere. So somewhere in this sort of neoliberal framework, there are the monks of neoliberalism. And actually the economists, in particular Dutch economists, have over the years become the monks of neoliberalism. They simply write these advices, they give these advices, they write these research papers, they write these policy papers, they infuse ministries, departments all over the place. They occupy to the brim the only economic policy advice organization on which the Dutch state relies. The Central Planning Bureau. It's all mainstream economics and it's all political to the core. But since there's only one economics, Dutch citizens lack the ability to see the political nature of the advices that are buried in the data and the mathematics that economists use. So one of the issues which I find quite striking is that there is this worldwide movement among economist students, which is called Rethinking Economics. It started out at the Manchester University, and the Dutch students of economics were one of the last to sign up to this particular movement. But the fact that they signed up at all is of course an indication that they too increasingly suffer from this sort of hegemonic, monocentric, groupthink-like way in which economics is being taught in the Netherlands.
Okay, we're slowly getting to the unavoidable end of this part of the program. I remember you, but first up there's a question. If you speak up, I'll repeat it for you.
Wat is je boodschap aan de Nederlandse bevolking? In het Nederlands alsjeblieft, dat zij het ook begrijpen. Of daar doorkomt. Eén keer. Graag deze één keer, Nederlands. Wat is je boodschap?
waar ik erg bang voor ben, is dat de zittende coalitie het hele moeizame mondjesmaat economisch herstel, wat de komende 2 jaar wellicht gaat plaatsvinden, gaat gebruiken om te bepleiten en te beargumenteren dat hun desastreuze afbraakbeleid goed voor Nederland is geweest. Kijk naar de verkiezingscampagne en de verkiezingsleuzen van de VVD. Kijk naar de verkiezingsleuzen van de Partij van de Arbeid. Ga naar de website van de Partij van de Arbeid die rond die verkiezingsleuzen is opgebouwd. En je ziet dat daar een verhaal verkocht wordt aan het Nederlandse volk dat alles wat goed gaat in Nederland is allemaal te danken aan dit desastreuze afbraakbeleid van de zittende coalitie. En ik ben zo ontzettend bang dat het Nederlandse electoraat er weer met open ogen in gaat trappen, net als in september 2012.
Dus?
Trap er niet in!
At this moment there is a new law. It's called the participation law. It sounds very beautiful. We participate. But the real meaning of it in our daily life, especially for people who are jobless and are depending on social income, is that they are forced into labor. They are forced to work without the right to build up a pension. They are forced to work without workers' rights, and they are forced to work without a salary. This is something that's happening officially since the 1st of January in Holland, but it has been happening already for at least 10 years, to my limited knowledge. How would you advise us to deal with this? Maybe, please.
Well, a simple answer is, of course, make the right choice when you're in the election booth and don't vote for mainstream parties. Because mainstream parties, there's a nice book, when you're in the election booth, make the right choice. Don't go for the mainstream parties. There's a nice book by Tariq Ali, who used to be a British radical from Indian origin. He's typically a sort of a protagonist of the 68 generation, and it's called The Extreme Center. The title is very sort of adequate, because what we've actually seen is that the parties, not only in the Netherlands, but more widely, have basically pursued quite radical, utopian, neoliberal policies. And actually, if you sort of look again through your eyelashes at the landscape of welfare states in the European Union, you have to admit that actually we seem to be living in what is a utopia for large publicly quoted corporations. Actually, at the end of the day, and I do know and I do automatically acknowledge that the language which I'm now going to use is sort of quite old-fashioned, but in the battle between capital and labor, labor has actually lost. And that is something that is increasingly become visible. The participatiesamenleving is nothing but a new term for the further erosion of labor market protections for which political movements have fought extensively over the last couple of decades. This basically means that also the Netherlands is gradually being transformed into the wet dream of any sort of CEO of whatever large publicly quoted corporation. We should make that clear. The press actually should try to make that clear, although they don't do that. But especially academics have a big task in order to set out the scene and describe what is actually happening. And then, of course, you can only hope at some sort of an enlightenment among the Dutch electorate that, again, they don't vote for the centre parties when the next chance of voting comes around, in order to stop this further process of transforming our democracy into a corporocratia. A place where large publicly quoted corporations basically call the shots and are able to transform this landscape in a landscape which serves predominantly their own interests.
I'm sorry, I have one final question time-wise, and I'm sure we can talk later on a lot, and that's already been promised to up there.
You bring a lot of bad news, and my question is, what can we do besides occupy?
What can we do besides occupy? I would suggest two things. First of all, try to find out how weak and how vulnerable the Dutch elite actually is. And it might very well be the case that what you seem to think of as over-asking with regards to the board of directors of the University of Amsterdam is actually going to be accommodated. Because it might very well be the case that the hold of the elites over those spheres of social life, which are basically the base, their power base, is actually quite brittle. And if you kick them, it might well be the case that the whole pyramid comes tumbling down. So, over-ask, that's the first step. And then the second step is, be aware that what you're doing here has much wider ramifications. And that basically means that you should try to make coalitions with, for instance, workers in other semi-public sectors in the Netherlands. I know that that is quite a task to accomplish, because you're now sort of only focusing on the negotiations with the board of directors. But let's try to construct something out of this which is of a more durable nature and is able to channel this sort of wide discontent in large parts of Dutch society, which is currently not being addressed by the existing political channels. Political parties don't do their job. They don't try to channel this discontent. Labor unions don't do it. So it has to come from somewhere else. And of course it's pretty obvious that this is small, it's disorganized, you lack funding, you lack resources. But if you don't do it, it has to ignite somewhere. So let this be the ignition point of a much broader political movement.